All right, this video is about the cerebral cortex, and then we'll also talk a little bit about split brains. So the cerebral cortex, if you remember from our portable brain model, is that thin layer of cells that are covering the brain. So you can kind of think of it as just kind of this, almost this covering, right? So we're having like your brain wrapped in tissue paper, okay, covering your brain. And the tissue paper can be subdivided into different sections. So first of all, the function of the cerebral cortex is mostly for higher order thinking. We can subdivide that tissue paper layering, that covering of your brain into several different areas and lobes, and the lobes kind of work on specific aspects, specific parts of thinking. But generally the cerebral cortex, the function is just higher order thinking. So first of all, we have frontal lobes. We talked about the frontal lobe when we were making our portable brain model, and we said that the frontal lobe is responsible for your speaking, muscle movements, making plans and judgments. We said that this is the area of your brain that is not completely developed until your mid-20s, and so that's part of the reason why teenagers and early 20s adults, young adults, are very impetuous, and they don't really think through decisions, and you know, they don't really have really great logic behind things. So I've said it before, and I'll say it again. This is also why, you know, if you've ever had this happen where you did something kind of stupid and your parents called you on it and said, "What were you thinking?" and you say, "I don't know." Because later on you're like, oh, maybe that wasn't such a great idea to have my friend surfing on the top of my car. Yeah, that'd be because your frontal lobe's not developed. Your parietal lobe, which is right behind your frontal lobe, is the sensory input for touch and body positioning. A lot of the lobes you can kind of think of as having to do with different senses. So your parietal lobe will take in the information as far as when you touch things, positioning of your body, as far as feeling how things are going. So this is kind of your sense of feel, your touch. Your occipital lobe is in the very back part of your brain, which is kind of funny because it has to deal with vision. So your information from your eyes has to travel all the way to the back of your brain to be able to actually process any information that you are getting from your eyes. And then your temporal lobe is going to be on the sides of your head. So think of it, it's just like your temples. It's not exactly where your temples are, but it is going to be on the sides of your head, and that's going to be receiving information from your ears. And so that should be easy to remember because temples on the side of your head, which is also where your ears are. So here's a good picture of the different lobes. So our frontal lobe is all the way up here. Our parietal lobe is going to include our motor cortex and our sensory cortex. Our occipital lobe is way back here in the back of your head. And then your temporal lobe, you have one on this side in the left hemisphere and one on the other side with your right hemisphere. So obviously this is a very flat picture. A couple other things, areas of the cortex that are included in there. Motor cortex, we talked about the motor cortex. That's that strip on your brain that is kind of at the end of the frontal lobe, beginning of the parietal lobe, that controls voluntary movements. So this is our choices on how we actually are going to move things. So as you might imagine, I am a talker with my hands. So as I'm even talking to this computer by myself, I am moving my hands, which is controlled by my motor cortex. And then the sensory cortex is going to be actually taking in information from touch and movement sensations. And so the interesting part of the sensory and the motor cortex, and I kind of mentioned this when we were talking about the portable brain model, is that the amount of your sensory and motor cortex that is devoted to each part of your body is not dependent upon how large the body part is, but more having to do with how sensitive that body part is. So for example, if you've ever, you know, in the summer noticed, you know, when you have flies going around, or you had mosquitoes or something, and if one lands on your face, you're just like, you know, trying to move it away from your face, you know, waving your hands all over your face and get it off, right? And automatic. Okay, but if it lands on, say, your knee, you're not likely to notice because your knee is not as sensitive as your face is. So that kind of shows how the motor cortex and the sensory cortex, the structure of it and what parts of the body are responsible in each part of the motor and sensory cortex are very similar in the structure of the motor cortex and the sensory cortex. And then the rest of the cerebral cortex, so other than the motor cortex and the sensory cortex, the rest of the cerebral cortex is what we call association areas. So this is going to be what's involved in higher order thinking and learning and remembering. And so other than these two little strips basically that goes over your brain at the back of the frontal lobe and at the beginning of the parietal lobe, the rest of the lobes are basically having to do with all this higher order thinking. And they're called association areas because they're generally associated with thinking, but they haven't really mapped a whole lot of the cerebral cortex to be able to say for sure when you're thinking of this part of the cerebral cortex kind of lights up. So that anything that's basically higher order thinking, remembering, that kind of a thing, that's association areas. And like I said, the association areas are located at all four lobes, and so it's association areas are in the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobes. So basically anything except for those two small little strips of motor cortex and the sensory cortex, all the rest is association areas. So I have a couple of pictures, so you can kind of see here's this purple is the motor cortex, and then the pink is the sensory cortex. And everything else in the parietal, occipital, temporal, and frontal lobe are association areas. So it's interesting because this was a picture showing basically the sensory areas, and it shows you that they have in here the motor cortex, and this has to do with touch, obviously, but then they're talking about auditories, a tiny little bit there, and visuals a little bit there, but the most of it is association areas, and this is just kind of our higher order thinking skills. All right, a couple of other kind of pictures, explanations. This is what I was talking about as far as the sensitivity. This is kind of a blown up picture. This is interesting because the pink is the motor cortex and the blue is the sensory cortex, and it kind of shows you where they are located. But the interesting part is it's this long strip that goes across, but as I said, it's going to be associated with these kind of weird little pictures here is showing you how sensitive that body part is. You can see that the bigger the picture, the more sensitive that body part is. So for example, your face, like I said, is huge here because your face is very sensitive, so it takes up a lot of both the motor cortex and the sensory cortex over here on the blue one. But then at the same point in time, your trunk, okay, your trunk is like the part of your body from your neck to your sternum, basically. That's going to be your trunk. It's not very sensitive, so it's a very small part on this picture. And so it's also not a whole lot of movement involved there, so there's a very small portion of the motor cortex that it takes up, and a very small portion of the sensory cortex. Okay, the trunk's right there. But you can see that they're basically mirror images of each other. There's a couple of things like, for example, teeth, gums, jaw, that's in the sensory cortex. That's, not necessarily as similarly reflected in the motor cortex, but you get the picture. All right. The only other thing that I want to talk about as far as cortex is concerned is this guy named Phineas Gage. So I wanted to, you probably noticed the story in your book if you read the module already, about this guy named Phineas Gage. And I've read a couple of things about Phineas Gage outside of your book. And so I'm kind of getting confused to start forgetting this is called source amnesia, where I'm forgetting where I'm getting my information from. But Phineas Gage, the story goes, is that he was a railroad worker, and he basically was in charge of explosives. And so he was supposed to go in this area and dig a hole, put these explosives in, get out of the way, basically, to be able to blow up this area to be able to make way for the railroad, right? Well, apparently, and I've read in several different accounts, maybe it was something that went wrong with the actual explosives or whatever. But the story is that you're supposed to go and put the explosives in, put the gunpowder in, and then you're supposed to put this, basically this wad of kind of cloth or whatever, and then you're supposed to tamp it down with the metal rod. And somewhere along the way, I read that Phineas Gage forgot to put the cloth in, and he was tamping it down. And of course, what happens is it blew up, and it blew the rod right through his skull. So you can kind of see the picture here. This is a depiction of what it actually would look like, right? So this is looking at going through his skull, and it did go through his, I'm trying to think here, his left eye. And in through his brain, obviously, and up to, through the top of his head. Okay, so he had this injury. The reason that they mention this in a psychology textbook is it is amazing because Phineas Gage, obviously he was like blown unconscious at first, but he gained consciousness and he was actually awake when they took him to a doctor. I mean, remember, this is, you know, like the 1800s here. And he was awake when they took him to a doctor, and the doctor could actually talk to him the entire time. And he was talking and speaking, and they were just like, oh my gosh, how is it you're sitting with this rod going through your head, and you still are speaking? Well, they removed the rod eventually, and obviously had a bunch of healing and things like that went on, as much as, you know, that modern medicine at the time could tackle. And this is supposedly an actual picture of Phineas Gage. And so as you can tell that he did lose his left eye. But the interesting thing is that, okay, so the rod actually permeated his brain. And after the accident, people talked about how he changed, and his personality changed because of this rod that went through and damaged part of his brain. So he used to be an easygoing, you know, guy that was, you know, nice and people liked him. And after the accident, they talked about how very quick-tempered he was, and how his whole demeanor basically changed after this accident. So it was a very good representation of basically what happens when you have this damage to this part of your brain. So if you kind of look at the picture, you can kind of imagine the parts of his brain that were actually damaged when the rod went through. Okay, so it was kind of interesting to show how his personality changed because of disrupting some of those association areas and even some of the frontal lobe. All right, the last part that I want to talk about is the brain divided. This is having to do with split brain procedures. And the split brain procedures basically were trying to go and prevent seizures, major seizures. I'm talking, this is, you know, to the point of that it was majorly disrupting their life, and they could not. They tried many other things, and nothing else worked, and so they would cut the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum, if you remember, is the fibers that connect the right and left hemisphere. And so the idea and the thinking is that the seizure wouldn't be able to basically bounce back and forth between the two hemispheres. It worked. So these guys, Sperry and Gazanga, actually cut the corpus callosum. So I think that's Roger Sperry, and I can't remember Gazanga's first name. But they cut the corpus callosum to stop these major epileptic seizures. The interesting part after the fact is what they could do with those split brain patients could actually do. And what they found is that the people that had cut the ones that had their corpus callosum cut could actually have their right and left side of their body kind of act independently, which was kind of a good thing and a bad thing, because they found that they could go and, for example, draw simultaneously at the same time with their left and right hand. If you give it a shot, try and draw a circle with your right hand and a square with your left hand at the same time, and you're not going to be able to do it. But people who have split brain procedures can do that, and it's fascinating. They can also go, and the problem is that, you know, the left hemisphere controls language and the right hemisphere controls creativity. And they would show, if you read in your book, they were talking about procedures where they would have them stare at a dot in the middle, and then you're looking at, you know, just out of the corner of your eyes, your left eye and your right eye, and what they saw out of their right visual field, they could always go and notify, and they could always speak that because the right visual field was controlled by their left hemisphere. But what they saw out of their left visual field, they were not able to say it. However, if they put the items out as an option, like, you know, multiple choice, they could always pick it, and they were even flabbergasted by that. They're just like, I didn't know I saw that. So that is another fascinating thing about the brain. All right, let me know if you have any questions. That's it.